Good evening. I'm actually very delighted to see so many of you here. We were wondering how many audience members will land up today, so thank you for joining us. But before we begin with the book, I have one little exercise for all of you. It's a little imagination that you'll have to do with me, so help me out here. So you finished this evening, you've gone back home tonight, you've had your dinner, you're ready to go to bed. You're having the last little bits of conversation with your family, and there's a knock on your door. You're wondering, who is it this late in the night? You open the door. There's the police outside, or the military, or the BSF. But they are people in uniform, and they insist that you have about half an hour to quickly pack some things that you might need over the next, they don't know how long, and that tomorrow morning you will be leaving for, they don't quite know where. And this happens to you all of a sudden, and you might want to ask why, and they give you an answer which either relates to your religion, or to your identity in terms of your gender, or your sexuality, or your race. Some answer that the nation deems fit to give at that moment. I just want you to hold that thought for a minute to understand that this has happened so many times in history, across time, across countries, and in this country as well. So today our discussion is going to be about this book called The Deoliwallahs. This is about the internment of Chinese Indians in 1962, when India was fighting a war with China. The thing is, and I saw that it says the secret of the Deoliwallahs. It's a secret because, you know, I have asked many people whether they know about this, and it's amazing how few people know about this. So in this audience, how many of you knew about this or still know what this is all about? Yeah? That's it? Knew only recently, and that's also less than 10 people. Dilip, does that surprise you?
Not anymore, because I was one of those 50 people, really, the majority till a few years ago. Is this on? Yeah. So I was I didn't know about that this had happened till a few years ago, and so I'm not surprised that most people don't know. It's just that's why you're calling it the secret of the Deoliwallahs. Nobody really knows that this happened. This whole episode.
And even after so many years. So I think what I will do is, Dilip, I'll request you to begin with telling us what is this internment about? What happened in 1962 to the Chinese Indians in India?
Okay. So I should also preface that by saying that I hope my co-author Joy will be on in a little while, because I mean she's firsthand, you might say. I'm just the fellow who jumped on the bandwagon. Mm-hmm. But I wanted to actually point out that it's acknowledge this other elephant in the room, coronavirus, in this sense that yesterday I was looking at on scroll.in. I think there was an article, a first-person account from Italy about the effect of coronavirus, and I just want to read out to you a couple lines from this first-person account, and it says, in Italy, the Chinese were shunned immediately. Their shops and restaurants lost business overnight. They were spat upon and sworn at. What everyone conveniently forgot was the fact that most of these Chinese people are in fact Italian citizens who were born in Italy, and some had never even been to China. So, I actually sent that to Joy because it must have brought back memories for a lot of Chinese Indians like her, because this is exactly what happened in 1962, leading up to 1962 with the war with China, of course. But leading up, there were all these hostilities on the border, and there was an increasing feeling of prejudice and hatred against the Chinese who lived in India. And that got, I mean, there's a long story there. There's a long story to the war, which I think we should also be examining. But the point is that a lot of them, what this got translated into was that, as you were talking about, there were knocks on the doors of many of these Chinese Indians across the Northeast. And you know, they were 3,000 of them were over time rounded up and sent on the trains to this little town in Rajasthan called Deoli, where there was a prison camp, and they were kept there for up to 5 years. Among those people, one of the women who was sent there was pregnant, and she is on the cover of this book. That's actually, and in camp she gave birth to a little child, a little girl, and things were so desolate there in the camp that she called that little girl Joy, because that's what the girl brought her, and that's Joy Ma, my co-author. This was obviously, this picture was taken before she was born. But so Joy spent the first 4 years of her life in the camp, and released in 1967. The last thing I want to point out about this is that most of these incarcerations actually happened after the war was over. The trains left for Rajasthan mostly about the end of November of 1962. And the war ended on November 20th, 1962. So Joy was kept in prison. Joy and her family were kept in prison for 5 years when we were actually at peace. So this is the crazy thing about this. Is one more crazy thing about this. So let me just stop there and let you take it from there.
Yeah. So you know, I have a lot of questions for Joy, because one wonders what happens to individuals, to communities, when they face such violent attacks, such terrorization, actually, from the state that they belong to, the state that they consider their own. Yeah. So I will keep that aside for now and wait for Joy. But coming back to you, one question that I have constantly felt every time, not just with this, but with the Japanese internment that happened in the US during the Second World War, and also what is happening more recently. How does a nation, a big, able, glorifying nation, feel so scared or pretend to feel that their security is at risk from a small bunch of people of a certain nationality? I mean, at some end, it seems like a total farce. At another, one wonders whether this is proving something. This is just a show, much like our Republic Day parades that you see. I mean, why do nations behave like this towards?
You know, I wonder this often, Arundhati. I was wondering this while I wrote this book, while I've been thinking about this issue. Why did we behave like that in 1962? And why did the US intern 100,000 Japanese Americans in 1942? There are other examples too. And also I wonder, I have a lot of regard for our Prime Minister at that time, Jawaharlal Nehru. Why did he, a man of otherwise liberal ideas, agree to this? And the only explanation that comes to me is that people, nations, leaders do strange things in wars, you know, and wars just warp people's minds, warp nations' collective consciousness in ways that we don't really fully appreciate, but we should be familiar with because it's happened so often. So, I mean, that's the only explanation that occurs to me, that in this case, that there was this war. Suddenly people started feeling suspicious of their neighbors who had been just their neighbors all along. Suddenly, because they look like those guys who are attacking us from across the border, you say, all right, well, we think there are spies here. And so the other thing, I was in California last week, and somebody asked me, at a meeting like this, and somebody asked me, were there any actual spies who were identified among these 3,000? And as far as I can tell, and Joy concurs with me, there were none. Yeah. So these 3,000 people were kept in prison for really no reason at all for up to 5 years. So it's just, that's just it. I think nations do crazy things in times of war.
And you know, this is also something I was wondering, that we have so many lovely poems and short stories and novels written about the love towards nations, but nation states really, they don't seem to want love. They seem to want fear from its citizens more than love, because that's what keeps happening, that you produce a whole story of fear, and that becomes your way of interacting with your citizens. So that's quite a strange thing that seems to keep happening every time new nation constructions happen.
Well, I think if you draw a border,
Yeah.
how are you going to persuade people that, you belong on this side of the border, not on that side?
Yeah.
Ultimately, seems to me the only logical way is to say, those guys across the border, they're pretty horrible.
Yeah.
And we are the really good guys. And that's
Yeah.
exactly the story that's being told on that side of the border.
Yeah.
So this is as ancient as mankind, presumably, and certainly emphasized when we started making these nation states, when the Europeans taught us how to make nation states, and that's what we're going through now. Hi, Joy, can you see us?
All right.
Yeah, there she can.
Oh,
yeah,
there.
she
Hi.
can see us. Yeah.
All right, I shouldn't be looking at this. Crazy. Yeah.
It's okay. Hi, Joy. This is Arundhati.
Myself.
We interacted on
Hi,
email.
Arundhati. Yes, hi. It's great to see you in person. So
Yes,
looking
same
forward
here.
to this.
Same here. So we've just begun our conversation, Joy. I just requested Dilip to give a context of what actually happened, because we realized in our audience only about 10 people knew about the internment that happened in the 1960s of Chinese Indians. So I will, if you will allow me, I will jump right into asking you a question. Should we do that?
Okay.
Yeah. So my first question to you is, an experience that is so violent and coming from a country, a nation that a community knows they belong to, what happens to individuals and communities? What is the impact that an experience of such utter violence have on the lives of individuals and communities?
Okay. Yes. Thank you for that. So from our experience, it's been different, right? So for people who went in as teenagers, for people who went in as adults, and then for people like me who don't remember or are the children of these survivors. So it varies. So I think for our parents, a lot of them had to, when they came out of the camp, they had to just start working. They didn't have a choice. They had to accept it and keep going, just to keep their families fed and hopefully get past another similar thing. So there was a lot of fear. Oh yes, there's one more group. The group is those who were not interned. So immediately there's fear and dread across the community. They are worried about everything. They don't want to be associated with the people who went to the camp, and they distance themselves within the community also. And so, so going back to the parents, they come out, they're silent about it. They just want to keep going. One of the biggest motivations for them is to educate their children, send them away, get them to a better place. For the teenagers and the children, it was really actually very eye-opening for me as I started doing the research for this book, because I knew the community well. My mom talks about it all the time. Dad didn't talk that much more. So for the parents, it was trying to get them out of the situation. For the teenagers and the children, it was actually very interesting and horrifying, because they lost, as you can imagine, depending on whether they were there for 2 years or 3 years or 4 years, they lost education. There was a huge gap in education. They could not go back. They were expected to work immediately. And some of them succeeded in, if they went to school, they succeeded. Others just had to stop studying because they were not thriving at school or doing academically well. And the last one is the children of the survivors. They live in both, there are two things. They live in silence, silence from their parents when it comes to talking about this dark experience. And then on the other hand, bursts of emotion. For example, they would try to ask and say, how was the camp? What children ask. And the answer would be, it was a bad time. Let's not talk about it. And then suddenly in another situation, they might just experience this anger towards something for not understanding what they went through. So I think the emotional impact is very deep, and it's very long lasting.
And Joy, from here I'll come back again to saying how did Joy, you and Dilip get together for this book? Dilip, would you tell us a little bit about how your journey began for this book?
So there's a friend of mine who I refer to as Jay in the book, who Joy knows her too. She's comes to dinner often I mean, she comes and visits Bombay, and she comes over for dinner. So one time in March 2012, I think she came over, and as usual, we were having dinner. And out of the blue, she said, "Did you know this happened? Did you know that we India sent all these prisoners to this camp?" And I could not, first of all, I did not believe it was true. But I could not believe, A, that it had happened, and B, that I had not heard about it. Because for better or worse, I consider myself a relatively aware Indian. Yeah, well, that's my job as a journalist. But and I could not believe I'd never heard of this. But anyway, so one thing led to the other, and I did a long article for Caravan that November, which was at the 50 years since the war, 2012. And that got circulated in the Chinese Indian community and so on. And then about 3 years later, 2015, Joy and 3 others whose stories are in the book, Stephen, Michael, and Yin, decided to come to Delhi and have a series of meetings where they just wanted to tell their stories. This is the first time I think any of them had actually made a trip like this. And they asked me to come and be at those meetings. So that's when I met Joy. A couple years ago, I was in California, and Joy and I exchanged mail, and she said that she had these oral histories, stories of victims, and she wanted to try and write a book. So I said, well, like I said, I was jumping on the bandwagon. I said, Joy, we should write a book together. And that's where this book came from. So. And
Joy, what has researching, documenting, and putting together the stories of such trauma been for you as an individual? And do you think somewhere there is a process of healing as well for the community? Or is it seeking justice, and which is also something that the community in the US is working towards, to ask the nation for an apology, to ask India for an apology. So how do you see the process of writing this book, the research, the putting together, for it to come out, these stories, for them to come out to the community?
So that's a great question. So for me, I think the biggest revelation was sometimes you can only write your own story, right? So you can't write other people's stories. But I realized in doing the research for this and building the relationships that allowed me to really get into the heart and soul of the experience they had, was that it is the story of a community. And that's what, it became clear to me that that's what needed to happen. And we have a very, kind of a small selection of these individuals. There were 3,000 Chinese who were interned, but I have like 7. And actually that was quite a lot, because not a lot of people want to talk about it. And then on the other hand, I realized that some of these stories had been told before. So for example, as Dilip said, when Michael, Ying, and Stephen were in India, we got quite a lot of press coverage, and they would talk about it, but it would be on video, right? And so time passes, people forget. So the collection of the stories is, I think, what makes it really powerful. As for the healing, there are groups that gather together as an alumni of the camp. It's kind of really bizarre, but that's how they have to look at it. And it's like a gathering of friends. They have communities in Hong Kong. They have communities in China, in southern China. They have and that big community in Toronto. And it's really for people to gather, see how things have moved on. And, they talk about the camp, but it's sort of, they also talk about how they've been since the last time they've seen them. And so there's healing going on in that fashion. I think the apology is very important to the AITCI, the group that is the most organized, which we are part of. That we ask and press and keep the story alive so that someday perhaps there will be an apology. But I think, as Dilip said in our previous talk, that the acknowledgement of it is first. Acknowledgement that such a wrong has been done to civilians is the first step. And the final part of it is there's small ways of healing. So, for instance, when my mom met Ying Marsh, Ying had left after 3 months, and she had no idea what happened to her father while he was in the camp for another year or so, a year and a half. And my mother was telling him the story of how he came to see her, my mother, after I was born. So he came, he brought a gift, and he, checked out the baby and said, oh, she looks great. And so Ying knew nothing about it, and she cried, when she heard that. And there's one more story which I'll just say, because I think a couple of people might be in the audience. For the most, the people in the camp were sort of kept together, but there was also a lot of separation, right? And there was a particular family in Bangalore where the parents were taken and the children were just left. And so, trying to talk to the people to sort of, because my mother got to know the parents, and so there's a huge gap in the knowledge of a very young child. She didn't know what happened to her parents. They won't talk about it. And so it's that, so for my mother to fill that gap would mean a lot, I think. So those are the different ways we manage.
And Dilip, if I may ask you, what exactly happened? How were people identified? Was there a list? Was there a certain document? Kuch kagaz dikhana padega? Yeah, was there, because as Joy mentioned, that sometimes the parents were taken and the children were left. And I was also wondering what happened to mixed families, because I'm sure there were many families that had mixed and mingled with other kinds of race, religion, etc. in the country. So how did the government decide who to pick up?
I think there was one very important criterion. It's the way people like Joy look. That's the bottom line. Seems to me that was it.
But you're also talking about the northeast of the country, where.
Yeah. So then, yes, so a lot of them do look like that. But there were also there are stories that you'll read in the book about, for example, an informer who I think just to save his own skin, started telling the police, you got to go to this family or that family, they're Chinese, or, here's somebody who's married a local, but he's actually ethnic Chinese. So there was people like that. And one of those informers, I think one of Joy's stories in the book says that he ended up in the camp himself. Yeah. So, he got his just desserts perhaps, but well, I don't want to say that. But so I think that's how it happened. There were, people knew where the Chinese-owned businesses were, the Chinese-owned restaurants were, and so the police just, came to those places and rounded up the people. In some cases, they were all ethnic Chinese. In some cases, they'd married the locals, so maybe they took away only the husband who was ethnic Chinese and left the others behind, and on like that. There were many stories of separations like that, as again Joy just alluded to with Yin's family. And one little story that I like to remember is that I heard from 2 or 3 different people, and then somebody else also, one of these survivors told me, was there was a man who had married a local Assamese woman, and he was taken away, but they were left behind, and they had 2 or 3 children or something. And then he was sent, like a lot of these people were, they were sent from the camp on boats to China at some point. So he went to China and made a life for himself eventually. And then at some point wrote to his family in Assam saying, I've made a life here, and, can you all come and join me? And by that time, the children had grown up. I don't know what had happened to the wife, but she wrote back to him saying, no, we can't because we're here. And the poor man committed suicide. So there must have been other stories like that. So, yeah, that's...
And what happened? Was there any follow-up on what happened to the people who left for China? Because there were many ships, like you write in the book, which came and took batches of people. How was it decided that these are the people who are going to go off to China? Was it a choice? And why did people choose that? And then was there any, did the community find out what happened to those who went off to China?
Joy, you want to answer that?
Yeah.
So the community did stay in touch, right? So the people who went to China and then when they could leave, they chose to leave. There were other people who continued to live in China, and those are the alumni groups that get together. But the communication is quite open for, but I'm not tapped into those groups, but within the groups, so say somebody went to China and now is here, she would talk to the people. So the journeys of all these people are very different. Some went to Canada if they were sponsored by their families. Some went to Hong Kong when it opened. Travel was allowed, and some eventually made it to the United States. There are very few in that way who are still in India, I believe. There was one person that I found and I wrote about her, but again, the fear is very deep and not a lot of people want to admit it. There were about 2,000 plus people who went to China, and in a short answer would be some still are there and a lot of people have left.
And Joy, do you think it's possible for a community that has been in many ways like this, betrayed by a nation, is it ever possible for that community to trust any nation, no matter where they find themselves? I ask you this question specifically from a personal experience. My father had to move from what was then East Pakistan to India, and somehow the paranoia of that exile, in some ways, never quite left him, to the extent that when I moved from Bengal to Bangalore, he would tell me, don't buy anything there. Just one fine day, people will tell you to leave. So this thing about any nation or groups of people will other you and tell you to leave is something that haunts people in different ways when they face exile or banishment or what happened to the Chinese community in 1962. So I was just wondering, what do you feel? Do you feel it's possible to trust any nation ever again?
It's really relevant. That's a really relevant question right now. It's really the question of who accepts you as a citizen and will they stand by it? I think it's difficult. It depends on the nation itself, but the reaction of two different people from the book. I'll just use that for Stephen Wan. He when he was applying for immigration to come to Canada, he was trailed by what seemed like a CID all the time. He would turn around and the person would be there. And he once he left, he actually didn't tell anybody he was from. He grew up in India when he was working. So all his colleagues didn't know that, and it was only after he retired that he was able to go back, as it were, to his roots and sort of reconnect and confront, go back to the place where he had been interned from. The other story is Yingsheng Wang, and Yingsheng Wang's story is quite something, because he went when he went back to Shillong, and in Shillong he went through every challenge possible. He had to buy back his equipment. He had to pay income tax for the years that he was in the camp. He had to show up every week to sort of at the foreigners registration office to say that he was there, and he had to pay a bus fare to go, pay a bus fare to go back, and it would take hours. And so that went on for several years until he was able to leave for Canada. And one of the things he says in his chapter is he felt no peace. But when he landed in Canada, he felt peace. He could finally relax. And so it took him a long time to sort of trust again another nation state. And it's the actions of those nation states that make you question whether it's your new nation state, the old nation state, really question many things.
Yeah. And you know, I was looking at this word, Dilip, internment, that one uses. And I was wondering why we haven't called it concentration camps, really. And you raised this question in the book, and scholar Andrea Pitzer, I think, said that what is a concentration camp? It's the relocation of a group of people of similar identity forcefully into a detention area by the nation state. And both for what happened to the Japanese during the Second World War in America and this, we consciously are calling it internment and not concentration camps, because even the word concentration camp suddenly puts the whole thing as if on a higher level of violent action. So I was wondering why you took, as authors, was this your choice to call it this, or how did this word, the history of the word, come to be attached to what happened to Chinese Indians in India?
So when I first started looking at this whole issue and and writing about it, this was a question that came up, and I remember discussing it in Delhi, perhaps, with some of my friends here, and they decided that in the community they were a little, as I could see it, a little unsure, a little wary of calling it a concentration camp or internment, incarceration. And so I respected that, and that's why I used to refer to it as an internment camp. But really, I think the reason that concentration camp has become a word that people are a little wary of is because you think of concentration camps, you think of the Nazis, you think of those gas chambers, and you think, well, that did not happen to the Chinese Indians. They were not put into gas chambers, okay? So if you want to think of concentration camps like that, that was not a concentration camp. But as you say, Andrea Pitzer does talk about this. If you look at a concentration camp as just being where you relocate people like this, then this certainly fits, and I think therefore we should call it a concentration camp. And I think interestingly enough, there's the famous Japanese-American actor George Takei, who was in Star Trek or Star Wars or one of those, I'm not sure, has now started, in fact, he wrote recently somewhere that we need to stop referring to the Japanese incarceration as an internment. We should really be calling it as an incarceration. He uses that word because it was an imprisonment. Their freedoms were taken away, and so the internment kind of downplays the issue. And I would like to see more of the Chinese Indians call it that, because this was a serious thing, and we should be willing to face up to that.
So this immediately brings me to two questions more to do with the present. And as I was reading in the book that, and this actually was told to me by a Chinese friend of mine, whose nieces were told, don't say you're Chinese, just say you're from Nagaland, when the Doklam incident happened a couple of years ago. And many Chinese Indians around that time were also feeling a kind of the old fear, the old pressure again, as to what's going to happen. Now, since India and China happen to be two countries who constantly, every few years, continue their disagreements, let's say, on the McMahon line and where the line should be drawn and whether it's a little bit this side or a little bit that side, it constantly puts this pressure on Chinese Indians to remain always fearful, because you never know when the balance is going to tilt the other way and suddenly 1962 is going to happen again. So how do you think this impacts the kind of justice, acknowledgement, apology that the community is looking for, Joy, from India? Does this sort of impact the movement that you are trying to build?
Yeah, I think every time there's a border conflict, people are just terrified, as you've said. A lot of them, I had a reporter recently want to talk to somebody in the Chinese community in India, in Calcutta, and we had to find somebody who was willing to talk, who wasn't still afraid of the stigma associated with the internment. There are, I don't know, there's still some elderly people in India who don't fit the category of being able to become a citizen, or they're still considered stateless, and so they have to renew their permits every year. So for them, they have, no matter where they are, they have to show up in Calcutta and go through the whole bureaucratic process, and that takes a while. So yeah, every time something happens, a ripple of concern goes through the groups that are outside. They talk about it, and then certainly within the community, I can just imagine people are just not trying to let it bother them, or they just go very quiet and hope nothing happens again.
But does that hinder the movement or the push for acknowledgement and apology that the community wants from India? Does it impact that in any way?
Not for the groups outside.
Yeah.
I think, so for the AIDCI, they would still like to press forward. It's just that we haven't ever heard a response back. So not sure what the next steps would be.
Yeah.
But no, I think they're pretty, I don't know what the Dilip thinks, but they're pretty resolute in wanting to
Okay.
Can I just
ask for
add
it,
to
but
that?
not taking action.
Yeah.
So in 2017, when Doklam happened, that was just about when there's something that we talk about in the book, which I actually start the book with the AIDCI, the group in Toronto, decided to make the symbolic move of going to the Ottawa High Commission, the Indian High Commission, and handing over a letter saying, addressed to Prime Minister Modi, saying we want to ask for an apology. We want an acknowledgement and an apology. So they were planning this for a long time, and apparently there was it was, for all these reasons, it was a worrisome thing for a lot of people. But they got a letter from somebody in India saying, and I've quoted that letter, which was saying that you should be careful of what you're doing, because the repercussions are what we feel here in India. Yeah. I already have people coming to my door every now and then and asking me for my credentials and all, and this is going to only worsen it every time we do this. And so, but the AIDCI, as she said, was resolute and decided to go ahead with this. And just to finish that story, what happened was that they went to Ottawa, and then we stood outside I joined them on that trip. And
So you were there when this was happening?
Yeah, when I heard about this bus trip from Toronto to Ottawa, I flew out there and I joined them on that trip. And so we stood outside the Indian High Commission for 2.5 hours. The Indian High Commission had been told that these people were coming and they wanted to hand over a letter, but the gates were closed, and the guy at the gate said, we have no orders to accept any letter. So after holding this demonstration and holding up placards and maybe shouting a few slogans, they actually taped the letter to the gate, and we went back to Toronto. So maybe that letter is still attached to the gate. I don't know.
And one can perhaps get some hope from the fact that America did apologize to the Japanese. And I've been wondering whether you might want to just compare the two situations and say what enabled the Americans to, what pushed them to do it. And my question also is, what do international bodies like the UN, for example, what role can they play when either citizens of a nation want an apology from that nation itself, or when citizens or one nation wants an apology from another because of what has happened in their past history? So what role do international organizations play?
Joy, I'm going to let you handle that.
Oh, okay. So the parallels with the Japanese internment is there were 100,000 Japanese Americans who were interned, and they were kept for about 5 years in these various camps all across the nation. And the reason why they were able to move the needle on getting an apology was the community actually was pretty quiet, but they had a lot of civil liberties organizations that were behind them. And they also had senators and other representatives of the people. And they worked it, they lobbied about it, they documented information, and
they continued to live in America while this was happening?
Yes.
So they were pushing it from within? Yeah.
From within, yes.
Yeah.
So they, you can imagine this larger body of people, some representatives in the government, and then the organizations that help push it. And Chinese Indians didn't have any civil liberties unions supporting them. Not one group, not one person objected to the incarceration of the Indian Chinese, the Chinese Indian, sorry, going back and forth. So I feel that Deoli camp in many ways was almost done like a playbook from the Japanese internment. You know, you round up a group of people, you put them in, you think you have a school, but there isn't really a school. And I think maybe they should, but for the lack of representation within India, you know, that would be a path forward. But you know, a lot of us don't live in India, and a lot of there is very, very little support from groups that would help push that forward. So I think, you know, going back to what I said, you know, first we have to have an acknowledgement that this was a wrong, and before we even start anything. So, so yeah, Dilip, you want to add anything to that?
Well, an acknowledgement that it even happened, Joy, because I don't even think that we've acknowledged that. We don't even know that it happened. So that's the first, maybe that's the first step. Acknowledge that it happened, then acknowledge that it was wrong.
Awareness building that this actually happened.
So, I mean, all I can hope is that this book will do a little bit of service in that respect. Just about the international bodies, I think it's a parallel question, you know, because how do you get an organization like the UN or whoever else to take an interest in this? You need people to go and lobby them and human rights activists or civil liberties activists, whatever. And like Joy was alluding to, there's a startling lack of those in India, at least, interested in this issue. I don't know if anybody, you know, if the PUCL or the PUDR or any of them have taken up this issue. And maybe that's something that we should try. We should try to get them involved.
But also one wonders, given that China's position of power in the world is what it is, even as a nation, if China could take any kind of role, because they did come and say, okay, we are going to take some of these people back to China as refuge.
I did this back in the Nehru Center too, I think, or somewhere else. I really don't like, forgive me, I don't like that word back. They were not sent, they were not taken back to China. These were people, these were our own Indian fellow citizens. So let's, just too often we say easily they went back to China. And you
but
know
they
that
were never there.
They were never there.
They were here.
And that language is being used again for Pakistan, if you're you know, going back to Pakistan.
Go back.
Yeah, so let's not use that. But that apart, it's true, I mean, maybe China would take an interest, I'm not sure. Honestly, I worry about what value that will have, because maybe it will be just seen as China trying to score propaganda victories over India. So I don't know. But so far as I know, they've not taken an interest in this issue so far.
Okay. Okay. And
sorry, I just want to jump in there a little bit. So I think it starts with the people to people kind of movement, you know, awareness building, making sure it sticks in the history books, making sure this book is really understood by people, because I think it does a very good job of talking about the history or the background behind it. So just awareness. I would like to go to a room and ask people, how many of you have heard about this? And there would be more than 10 hands that go up, you know. That would be a huge thing for us, for me, to make sure that this story is not forgotten. And there are other ways of sort of commemorating it in visually or in other forms. So I think that would move the needle a little more.
Yeah. And so with that, I want to ask you, Joy, so there were challenges in the camp that comes out through all the conversations of the people who were there. And again, when talking about concentration camp, one imagines torture or dehumanization in a certain way. But what one realizes reading these accounts is that they don't always have to be the same. Loss of dignity, humiliation or dehumanization can happen in so many ways. Like the stories that are there in the book about being controlled, every action that you do in this camp is controlled by permission, by several layers of hierarchies. That was quite revealing to say that, you know, it doesn't happen just in one way. But what were the challenges of going back? Because that was another whole series of challenges. People went back at different times. They were sent back to different places. What were some of the challenges of actually going back to the homes, so to say, or home cities?
Right. So all the people who were left in the camp were the ones who chose to stay in India and to go back to their lives. And so regardless, so what happened was after the incarceration, certain areas like Kalimpong and Darjeeling were declared very sensitive areas, right? And so people who were from that area could not go back. So they were sort of dumped in the next big hub, and the big hub was Calcutta. And so people who did not ever live in Calcutta were just thrown in there. And if you had family, great, you had a place to stay. If not, then you had to, spend some time in different places, right? There was a school, there was a funeral home. And so people had a really hard time. So when they landed, and then they had to petition for permission to go back to Darjeeling and go back to Kalimpong to retrieve their materials. And of course, when they went there were different, stages of, different things that happened. Some people had lost everything. Things were stolen. Things had just rotted, with the weather. And so not a lot could be retrieved. And then for other people, like the people from Shillong, they were allowed to go back. And I think, I don't have it in the book, but I've heard anecdotally that some people actually got their belongings back and they were able to rebuild their lives. But the person I have in the book, Ying Sheng Wong, he had a hard time. He had to just, as I mentioned, go through all the hoops, report back, went to the Godam, and there was nothing left there. Everything had been eaten. So the path after the camp was actually very, very difficult. In another story, Michael Cheng's story, he was 6 when he went in, maybe 9 when he came out, and tried to go to school, was unsuccessful, and at age 14, he had to start making shoes and live. And so he would be making shoes and selling it, buying new materials, and so a very, very tough life. And so a lot of them chose to leave the country.
I want to add, actually, Joy has not told you that about, and you should read in the book about her account of what happened to her family, which was sent, her mother was deposited essentially on the streets of Calcutta with these 3 children without any money and, left to fend for herself. It's worth reading that account. But the other thing, when you mentioned about dehumanizing, one real particularly interesting aspect of this dehumanizing is, at least to me, it seemed is what happened when Lal Bahadur Shastri, who was the Home Minister, made a visit to the camp in, I think, April or May of 1963. And all these people gathered around him, and they, asked him, when are we going to leave, and so on. And whatever answer he gave there, he went back to Delhi, and then a few weeks or months later, he appears before the Rajya Sabha, and MPs start asking him, what's going on in that camp in Deoli? And there is a transcript of this session that you can get online, which is how I read about it. And he actually tells these MPs, I went there, and all these people are very happy to be in the camp. This is Lal Bahadur Shastri, another man for whom we've grown up having a lot of respect for. Why did a man like that go there and say this about this? It makes no sense to me.
One story that haunts me from the book is right after that, I think there is a woman, I don't remember, Joy, if that was your mother, who asked the warden of the camp that, so when are we going to go back to India? So when are we going to go back home? So the warden asked, so you chose to stay in India, right? And she says, yes. And the warden looks at the ground and says, this is India. And I mean, especially today, especially with what's happening around the country again on the question of citizenship, you are suddenly thrown at that these are everyday people doing their jobs. And it comes with this kind of, each word cuts you into pieces. I would like to now move for the next couple of questions to much larger ideas of what the book throws up, especially towards the end, about citizenship, what it means for a nation and for a citizen, what is this relationship that we're talking about, and what are the dangers of what's happening around us today. But before that, Dilip, if I can request you to just to give a sense of the book, if there's a part of the book that you might want to share with us, read a little bit, maybe.
Well, as it happens, there is. So this is, I'm just going to read you a little bit about, so Joy actually has written in great detail a number of the stories of people who were in the camp. But so I also met some of these people, or I met a number of different people whose experiences told me a little bit about what had happened in the camp. And so this is a little bit about a man called John Wong, whom I met in Tinsukia. He runs a Chinese restaurant there. And he was sent there when he was a kid. His father had a timber business, so when they came back to Tinsukia, the timber business was gone and so on. You can read the details in the camp. But just when I met John, he took me into this it's called Hong Kong restaurant in Tinsukia. Incidentally, in a place which is interesting, is called, that area of Tinsukia is called Chinapatti, even today. Chinapatti, meaning that it's the Chinese neighborhood. But, so John Wong was sitting there, he fed me Hakka noodles for which he refused to let me pay, and talking to me about what happened. And this is just a small part of what I wrote about him. 1 year after reaching Deoli, Wong lost his 5-year-old sister to chickenpox in the camp. 3 days of fever, he told me. Her skin turned black and there was no doctor service. In 1966, the family was released from Deoli and returned to Tinsukia. They did not have the 25 paisa rickshaw fare to get from the railway station to Chinapatti. Wong's father and the rickshaw driver were just getting into a fight when someone stepped in and paid the fare. But there was worse to come. All the machinery had been stolen from the timber mill. Various people had appropriated the cars. One elephant they heard had died, another had lumbered away, and nobody could say what had happened to the rest. The people who had property like us, Wong said to me in Hindi over his noodles, tears now welling up in his eyes, had been broken. We had to sleep on the veranda of our old house for a month because nobody would give us the key, he said, while one tear rolled down his scraggy cheek. John Wong's family had been in India for generations, but their home had been seized and sealed as enemy property. His mother, sprightly at 86, walked in right then with bags full of supplies from the market. As she passed us while we were still eating our noodles, she must have noticed her son's tears, for she whispered to him, but in Hindi and loud enough for me to hear, "Don't talk about these things, they are finished now." The truth is, they were finished in 1962. Wong told me that his father would say about their life before Deoli, "I used to have tiger heads in my pocket," referring to the 100-rupee notes of the time that prominently featured the Ashok pillar. But after 1962, John said everything was barbadi. That's all.
So as we come to what we are facing in India now, and there's this huge question about citizenship, what it means. You mention in the book the dangers of blood and race determining citizenship, and how that might impact the idea of India that we had. What do you mean? What are these dangers that you see?
Let me answer that by saying that the one hopeful sign I see in all these protests against the Citizenship Amendment Act now is that people are now starting to talk about our Constitution. So at least there is whether it's a small or a big, I don't know yet, some subset of Indians who are saying we are Indians because of this document that we adopted in 1950. You can argue about whether that's a good document or not, that's another issue, but at least they're not saying I'm Tamilian, I'm Muslim, I'm Hindu, and that's why I'm Indian, or I'm Tamilian first, or whatever, as we've gone along for so long. And I think to our detriment that we've looked at these lesser identities. That the Constitution defines us as Indian, and I think if we defines India and defines who is an Indian, and if we can adopt that more widely, if more of us are able to see the worth in that, I think we will be a better nation. But unfortunately, we haven't. That's the trouble. I think we haven't done that, and therefore it's easy for people to say things like, go back to Pakistan, or take action against the Chinese Indians in 1962, and so many other things that we have as blots on our record in this country. I mean, there's a long, long history of of things that we should not have done. And if we want to really start with acknowledgements and apologies, we can start with the Chinese Indians, but there are many others who need them too. So those are the dangers really of trying to define, to me it seems those are the dangers of trying to define nationhood or being Indian in terms of these blood and race, as you mentioned, because then, then it becomes too easy to point to somebody else and say, that guy is not the same as me. He looks different, he talks a different language, so therefore he's less Indian. And it's time we move beyond that. We've had a constitution for, 70 years, and it's time that we started looking at ourselves as Indians in that light.
Also, the nation itself is a very modern construct, and there is a life before the nation when blood and race also mixed up in many different ways. And Joy, you asked you pointed to a very interesting idea in our email conversation where you spoke about how the migration that is happening now, both inside the countries as well as across countries for work, really, has come to a clash with this idea of nation and nation construction. Would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Right. So I live in the Bay Area, the San Francisco Bay Area, and when you are working in a tech company, for instance, you look at the engineering crew, it's all either Indians or Chinese, right? And so there's a huge need for this talent, and these are the people who come to fill that gap. So for me, it's pretty cool because I can speak Chinese, so I can chat with them in Hindi, and actually everybody's from the South, so all our Hindi is pretty bad. But so it's really great to be in this global community. But who's to tell, when we have incidents like this or other types of incidents in the world, what's going to happen? Is somebody going to question one at some point, how far you go back or why you deserve to claim citizenship? And so I want to talk a little bit about the situation of why the Chinese went to India. And it has a lot to do, in fact, it all has to do with tea. And if you want to look further back, it's really the Opium War. And so, you have this imbalance of trade, and the English wanted to find different areas of production for tea, and they moved, seedlings and tested several areas in India. And in Assam, a certain type of tea grew well, where other types of tea grew better in Darjeeling and the Siliguri, Duars area. And so with it came the migration of the Chinese, right? And so they were filling a need for the expertise in tea growing, and then in building the factories. And then once you have some community like that, then other people come in, people who supply the groceries, the other needs, writing back and sending money back to their families. And then there's another small subset of migration that was happening at the time. There were all the indigenous Adivasis who were coming and supplying the labor, because at the time there was nothing in northern Bengal, West Bengal, what was to become West Bengal. So they needed laborers to work, and there were no villages, nothing. And so you have this whole group of tribal people who were coming and working. They worked for my father's family, and they would bring great amounts of people. And so some of those people stayed there. So are they accepted as a part of Bengal? Is somebody going to jump up one day and say, you don't really belong here? So these migrations for work, they're happening more and more. We're just scratching the surface. There's a lot of movement. People these days, they study, they go to different places to build a new life. And these are issues that nation states have to confront, and I hope they do it with thought, with deep perspective and intelligence.
So just a couple of more questions, and then we'll open it out to the audience. I saw something very interesting. There are several acts, as you say in the book, which come together almost as fig leaves, legal fig leaves to justify an action. So the first thing I thought about was the NPR, the NRC, and the CAA. And then when I look at the book, I find the Defense Act, the Foreigners Act, the Restricted Areas Order, etc., all playing together to make this, what happened to Chinese Indians, justifiable legally. Because somewhere when you put all these three together, you can find a so-called logical reason for the nation state to declare that these people should be, can be seen as suspicious, they are hostile origin. So that's also an interesting term I learned from the book. Hostile origin. Your intention of hostility doesn't matter, as long as your origin is seen as a hostile one. When do countries suddenly wake up? This was wartime. But say recently what has happened. For many years, we've slept on this. We haven't really asked the question, who is a citizen, who's not a citizen, why should somebody be a citizen, who should we take citizenship away from, who should be suspicious of. And suddenly, again, we've woken up to ask these questions, which are totally not required, given the many other sort of dangers that the country is facing, economically, socially, and otherwise. So what do you think makes this happen, Dilip? What triggers this mechanism to start working together in these evil axis of trios of acts and legal indictments that enable processes of othering?
Because it sells politically. You know, it's much easier to convince the voting audience that you should vote for me because I'm throwing all those outsiders out. And you know, they're taking away your jobs and they're killing you or they're really hostile, whatever it is. And I'm going to get rid of them, and that's the reason you should vote for me. It sells a little bit better than if you say, you know, I'm going to build a house for you, or I'm going to solve your water problem, or I'm going to build schools for you. Somehow, those other things don't bring in the votes. Is that a failing of us as voters? I don't know, but it certainly, I think, explains why, you know, right now, certainly explains why what happened in 1942 to the Japanese Americans, what happened in 1962 to the Chinese Indians, it certainly explains what's happening now with the CAA and the NRC and so on. I mean, to me, this is a government that has no record to stand on, and so they know that they can get a lot of support by raising these issues of, to my mind, bogus issues of citizenship through this CAA and the NRC and so on. Yeah, so it's a simple answer.
And my last question, actually, I go back to the writing of the book, and this is a very interesting case of an insider and an outsider writing a book together. And so this question is for both of you to answer from your own perspective. What do you think, as researchers, writers, are the ethics that should guide you? What are the dangers that you should keep in mind? What are the maybe rules or terms of engagement? Because what you're dealing with is deep trauma, vulnerabilities of people, experiences that have left many of them emotionally broken. So when these stories are made public through a book that you're putting together, what are some of the things that as scholars, researchers, writers, that you would like to keep in mind so that it is an equal exchange and it does not become exploitative in any way? So Dilip, I come to you first as an outsider. What did you have to keep in mind?
I had to keep in mind that this is not my story, you know. So when I first did my first article about this, of course I went and met a number of people, and had I not got to know Joy, you know, possibly there was a book in it and I would have been writing the stories of some of these people. But it did strike me that there's always a question of authenticity. There's a question of, do I tell the stories? I mean, who am I to choose the stories to tell? How do I choose them? And am I telling them correctly? So it worried me. I mean, it worried me in the sense that I wasn't convinced that I could pull off a book like that, an entire book with telling stories of individual survivors, which I thought a book like this would need to have. So, like I've said twice already, when Joy happened to mention that she had these stories, I said, well, here's the, if we do it together, you do the stories, because, you know, then there is that authenticity, and she knows how to handle it. She knows some of those people better than I do, all that. Whereas I felt then that left me to do what I thought were my strengths, do the research and look at the history, and that also
Also
interested me.
contextualize the whole thing in a
Yes,
certain way.
yeah. So, and that also interested me, and I wanted to do that research and get an understanding of what happened in 1962. So it was, to me, it was a really easy, obvious division of labor, and you know, to Joy's credit, it really went well. She wrote the stories, and then I wrote my background, and we found ways to put it together. And I hope we've managed to put it together in a relatively smooth narrative.
Yeah.
So, Joy, do you have comments about that?
Sure, I'll jump in. So even as an insider, for me, you know, as I mentioned earlier, I realized that it was not just my story, it was a story of a community.
Yeah.
And by the 50th anniversary of it, so you can imagine 5 decades later, people were ready to tell their stories. They were, but they wanted to also be very careful about how they said it. So once I got to know the people, and some remembered me as a baby, and you know, everywhere I go, you know, when there are people from the camp, they're like, oh my gosh, you know, this is the one who was born there. So you know, sort of that kind of, unfortunately, my reputation preceded me, and a lot of people still look at me as the little girl, you know, if you can imagine that. And so it was easier for me, you know, to have conversations. It took several conversations, you know, getting to know them, traveling with them, and then, you know, preparing them for that big interview that we would, you know, we would record and, you know, write from. So I think all the survivors should be able to tell their stories to somebody, you know, whether it's orally or somebody's going to transcribe them. They should tell it as part of their healing. But I felt that in writing the book, that since I knew the camp so well, since my mother, you know, talks about it a lot, it was a little bit easier for me to really understand the depths of their despair. And you know, these days we look at these people, they are successful, they have, you know, raised families, they're in retirement, and they're leading a good life, but you don't understand what despair they went through. And so I was able to tap into that emotional quality because I didn't have to figure out, you know, what did the camp look like, you know, what were they doing. So I think writing from the community is appropriate. Everybody agreed to doing that. They understood what was needed, and I hope it encourages other people to come forward and tell their stories.
Thank you. Let's open it out to the audience.
Hi, Joy. My name's Amina. There's a recent museum that's been opened here of Indian paper money, and there I found there were many notes of these, I don't know what they were called. I think they were called POW camps. I don't know if they used the term internment camp, but there's currency. So, you know, each camp had like its own currency. There was Ahmednagar, there was Deoli. And so this, it wasn't just the Japanese internment. I think we have a long history of internment here, starting with World War II. So I was wondering, how was this money handed out? I mean, did you have to work for it? Or did you know, was it just handed out every week, every month?
I believe it was handed out every week. So the government took care of all the food. All our folks refer to it as the coupons. And so they were like $1 rupee, 5 rupees, and 10 rupees or something like that. And so with that, you can buy extra supplies. So the rations for each family was, you know, you'd get rice, flour, and then for the perishable goods, they would have a cart that came in that gave vegetables and meat. And then with the money, that's what they purchased, things like, you know, toothpaste, soap, and other things that the camp didn't provide. Sorry.
I look here? Yeah. Hi, Joy. My name is Kea. I am a fellow journalist, colleague of Dilip's. My question is, actually I'm wondering how much of ethnic culture has contributed to this lack, or let's say this black hole of awareness in India. You know, I grew up with an entire family of Chinese, Indian Chinese, okay, where the the kids' fathers, father and uncle, during the 62 war went off to Bhutan, and the sister and the husband, sister's husband, went off to this camp in Deoli. And it's only now that the children talk to me about it. Look at our age. So we were very close, but all through these years that we've been together, they never ever spoke of this. So I'm wondering whether part of this is because of this deep silence where you don't want to speak about it to others. I've just been hearing this. So has that also contributed? Even now, we don't have anyone in the Chinese community in India who stands up and says, except for maybe one. I haven't heard of anybody else. So what are your comments on this?
Thank you. It's a really difficult topic to talk about. You know, for a lot of people, it's digging up the past, and I see it differently. I see it as educating people about something that has relevance anytime, today or the future, or globally. The silence is difficult, but also easy because the less you draw attention to yourself, the better. It's, you know, people basically want to assimilate. People want to be friends. They want to be a part of the community. And anything different is not something anybody wants. So especially with the Chinese, we're very visibly different. So, you know, I think the people who live in India, they're as Indian as you can be, you know, except they eat the food, they speak the language, they like the same things like any other person growing up there would be. So I think the silence is sometimes deafening, but there are people who still want to, who are more comfortable being silent, and I respect them for it. I'm not going to ask anybody to say anything they're not comfortable with. But I think what they also may want to pay attention to is the reception of the story. You know, the reception is much better. People are talking about it. They are willing to be educated. They're willing to share the story. And for the relevance it brings now globally, I think it's a story that I would recommend everybody to sort of listen to, think about, and move forward. And the last comment I want to say is that family that you talked about is my family.
Yeah, I was just curious. I mean, coming back to the book, okay? So I was just curious to figure out whether there was some kind of a demand from the general populace for this kind of a move, or is it something that the cops invented to kind of please the government, you know? So how did this happen? Was there, at this point in time, maybe we have a fringe elements who are looking at the Dhimak and so on and so forth in the country. I was just wondering, when a war happens, whether, you know, there is a pent-up demand, which is why the politicians are actually doing these things. Was that the case in the 1962?
I don't know if there was a demand to imprison the Chinese Indians. I'm not sure about that, but certainly there was my understanding, and I think Joy would bear me out on this, is that there was a lot of prejudice and hatred against these people, hostility, because there had been years of incidents on the border, which we perceived as being betrayals by China, and then the war itself that we perceived as being a great betrayal by China. So there was a hostility against anybody who we perceived as belonging to that particular group, and that therefore was easy to translate into what Arundhati referred to as this legal fig leaves, a whole series of laws that eventually gave India the legal framework to do this imprisonment, to do this incarceration. So
there's just one thing I would like to point out here also with this, when we asked for whether it was a popular demand or whether the state did it. And one might think of it as chicken and egg. But I think if we look at the 1984, the Sikh pogroms that happened, there are certain states where it happened, and there are certain states where it did not happen. And I think the state has a very important role in saying that this shall not be tolerated, and these are the steps that will be taken if something like this happens.
Or this shall be tolerated.
Or this shall be tolerated. So I think the impunity with which people can act against a community often depends on how strongly the state says that this shall or shall not happen. So the state cannot wash their hands off by saying, well, this was popularly demanded. Just to say, because the Sikh pogroms came to my mind saying, I was in West Bengal, and there's a large community of Sikh population in West Bengal. But the one good thing that the left government did at that time was no nonsense. Like, this will not be tolerated. And much, much fewer kind of atrocities happen in West Bengal as compared to some other, Delhi, for example.
Somebody there had a...
Should I? Okay.
You can face her if you like.
Great. Wait, Joy, can you see me?
If you come here and somewhere here and just face
Great,
the mic,
great.
so Joy can see you.
Forward.
Hi, Joy.
A little
Great. My name is.
Yes, I can.
Great. My name is Jack. I've actually emailed you a few times, I think. And I'm a fourth-generation Japanese and Chinese American. My dad's parents were put in Tuli Lake and Poston during the Japanese internment or incarceration. But my question is actually, having grown up in India and then moved to the U.S., I know that assimilation in the U.S. for Asian Americans, particularly East Asian Americans, is potentially very, very different than how the Chinese have been assimilated into India. And I wonder if you can speak to some of the experiences that you've had both in India, but then also moving to the U.S. and what that's been like.
You're the guy who emailed me, Jack Fukushima, right?
Yes.
Hi.
Thanks for the question. Growing up in Calcutta in a small convent, it was very typical experience. You know, I was one of the 2 Chinese girls who were there, but I grew up with my friends, and I saw myself as no different in the school, and you know, when I associated with them on the street, sometimes I can count about 2 or 3 incidents where people would call me a racial slur. I was a small girl at the time, and you know, I was really angry. It was from a young boy. But other than that, you know, besides the fact that, you know, when you cross the border with my Indian passport, you know, the policeman looks at the identity and looks at me and doesn't know how to process it, but, you know, based on the fact that it's a legal document, lets me through. So I got a lot of that. You know, I waited a little longer at the checkpoints because I was clearly very different. And at some point, I'm sure they thought, oh, she's from, you know, the Northeast. Also, going to Lady Shri Ram College, it's probably the only Chinese girl there. But, you know, again, you're in the company of your friends, and you're studying, and I'm friends with all these folks to this very day. The nice story is my agent is my best friend's sister from elementary school.
Sitting here in the front row.
Know,
Yeah,
Hey,
I don't know if you can see her, but she's sitting in the front row.
So, yay. Wait. So my roots are very deep. Coming to the United States, I think it was easier to assimilate because there are that many more Chinese already in the community, already, you know, working, going to school. To say that I haven't had racial slurs thrown at me, it would be incorrect. I have had also a handful of people calling me different ethnic groups, calling me out for being for different, or they're just mad at me. So I think the community here is bigger. It's more, you know, you have more people, more experiences to share. And then from India, the experience is so unique. You know, for us to have been in the camp, that's a common experience. I think every time anybody from India who is from the Chinese community sees me, I'm associated with being in the camp. So that's a really unusual experience. But hope that answered your question.
Are there any other questions? Yeah, Saras?
Do I have to? Okay. My name is Saras, and I have a confession to make first before the question. I put my hand up when you said who knew about this event. And I have to confess that all I knew was that a road had been driven through Calcutta's Chinatown, and it had really severely affected the economy. Until a few years ago, I read a book called Chinatown Days. Does anybody know that book?
Yeah, it's,
I was very moved by it.
it's
I'm not-
Rita Chaudhry's book.
Yes. I don't know how authentic it is, but I do know that at that time it really opened my eyes, and I was horrified to learn that this had happened. What it made me wonder about at the time was that the significance of this event must be quite different for people from those internment camps, or whatever you want to call them, who then left India, and for those who stayed. Now, for those who stayed, is there any sort of cohesive movement? How do they see it? How do they see themselves in India today? And how threatened do they feel? I think a lot of us feel threatened in India today. But they, particularly with that experience behind them, is there any kind of common experience that they feel?
Joy?
I think for the folks in India, there isn't a movement. People just want to be productive in their lives and move on and be successful. So as far as I know, there isn't any organized activity. The only organized activity that I know of is from the group in Toronto, and that is, doing it at a very high level. They know, and there's no real clear plan except to have a goal in the future. So yeah, that's all I have.
Yeah. So if we have no more questions, I'll just take my privilege and ask one last question that I've been dying to ask. We talked about awareness building. Oh, there is. Oh, sorry. Yeah. There's
one more
mic.
question. Oh.
Yeah, there's one more question.
Hi, Joy. I wanted to know when did you find out about your family history, and what were like your first few feelings and thoughts about it? How old were you when you understood about what your family had gone through and where you were born, etc.?
Okay, let me see if I can find the piece that I write in the book. Sorry. Okay, I'll read a short piece from the book. One of the first moments when I began to connect the dots was when I was 5 years old, after my family was released and came to Calcutta. My parents and I were looking at photo albums of their time. There are no photos of me, I said. There were photos of my brothers and my parents from their days in Hashimara. On the following pages, there were many cousins, uncles, and aunts, but my grandparents, whom I knew only through their fascinating stories. The albums were full of images of my eldest brother, Lyndon, as a baby, then a toddler, and a young adult. As for my brother, William, the photo of his shorn head and chubby cheeks smiled at me from every page. I could see the twinkle in his eyes as he grinned toothlessly at the camera. But all I could think of that afternoon was that there were no baby pictures of me. Why are there no photos of me? I asked. My parents smiled and looked at me with an expression I didn't recognize at the time. We were in the camp, and we didn't have a camera when you were born, Mom explained. So a long answer to that question. I knew from the get-go, from the stories that Mom would tell me. She would say, "You were born in the camp, you know. This is what happened. This is the story. Your brothers were here. You know, we had little ducks, we had chickens." And then as it rolled on for more and more, and people would see me, they would say the same thing. You know, oh, there she is. Oh, she's so big. So from the start, I think it was not seeing photos of myself, but then also realizing that it had deeper meaning when people would identify me as that person. And for a long time, it was really annoying to be only associated with the camp. That's the only thing they could see in me. From an insider's point of view, you know, you never are really far away from that experience when you're in the company of the people who have been there.
Thank you. I'll go back to my last question. Building awareness about this, as Dilip, you said, maybe that's the first step, even before the government acknowledging. So we have this hardcover book. What else do you think you will do, and what else can we do as readers, as people who, some of us are also part of the movement today, anti-CIA movement today? But are there ways in which we can engage with this? Is there a film that one might hope to see? I'm just asking, how will you take this forward, and how can we?
Well, my hope is that everybody in this room buys, like I keep saying, 20 or 100 copies each of the book, and then circulate them to all their good friends. Absent that, well, certainly read the book. I mean, there's plenty to learn about this issue, and plenty to think about, especially in this climate that we're in today. I keep saying that it's fortunate that the book has come out at this time, but it's a damn sad thing too, because history is repeating itself. There is a film, I mean, there are two films that actually Joy and I know, but Joy figures in one of them. It's made by this filmmaker, Rafiq Elias. I don't know if some of you know him. And they're available on YouTube. One is called these two are, the earlier one is called The Legend of Fat Mama, which is a story about Chinatown in Calcutta. But the other one that is specifically about this issue, and where Joy and Yin and Bobby, I mean, Yin Sheng Wong, whom she mentioned, also figure, is called Beyond Barbed Wires, and that's there. And it's worth looking at, because that gives you a little bit more of a visceral account of what happened. And what do we hope to do with this? I mean, you know, I hope to just be talking to people like this. That's what I wrote the book for. And I mean, I hope that Joy has a similar purpose in mind.
Yeah, we definitely want this book to be heard far and wide, you know, beyond our circles, to really have people curious about it. It's a book for, I say, for everybody, because at some point in your life, you're going to be an outsider. Whether you're in a community where you're a minority, you know, you could fall in all sorts of categories, you know, economic, social, geopolitical. So it's for everyone. It's really a human story. It's a universal story. It's about families struggling and making it at the end. And some of it is, you know, it's just not knowing what your neighbors have gone through. And we hope to tap into human kindness, really, you know, for your fellow person. We want to get it heard. We are going to do talks, maybe, who knows, something visual in the future. We don't know, but, you know, slow steps. But yeah, do buy a couple of books and tell people about it. Yeah, tell someone you know.
She has the same idea as me.
Yes, and yeah, and maybe we could talk to universities, colleges, to have talks by you and by Joy joining us like she did today. Joy, I would like to thank you and the entire community, actually, for sharing your stories with us. This must have been a really hard journey to first live it and then relive it by telling, sharing, writing. So thank you so much. And there's so much in the book. I've read it once fully and then again skimmed through it. There's just so many lessons for today in so many different ways. So thank you very much And do convey our thanks to your family and to all the survivors whose stories and accounts that they've so generously shared in the book. Dilip, thank you for being here with us and talking to us, taking us through this book, and also connecting it to our immediate circumstances that we find ourselves in. Thanks to the audience for patiently listening to us, asking questions that you are, and I do hope you will help to take this story forward. Buy the book, it's outside, and today there's a discount on the book.
I don't know.
Yeah.
They didn't give me one.
I got one. So I think if you buy 2 or more, you might get. So it's always a gift for a friend. Many of us are connected to education spaces, universities, colleges, and maybe if we can make opportunities for Joy and Dilip to even join through digitally, through the internet, to classrooms, it would be great. So thank you so much for that. Good night.